Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history in an attempt to understand the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences. Lying 2 hours from Paris, along the Loire River, in the Upper Brittany region of western France, lies the city of Nantes, a mid-sized portside town, known for its unique blend of medieval history and an expressive, quirky art scene, most famously known for inspiring Arthur Jules Verne to write 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, whom as a child watched the steamships go by. The Château des Ducs de Bretagne is its main attraction, a completely restored medieval castle where the Duke of Brittany once lived. And Les Machines de Lille is famous for its steampunk-inspired mechanical beasts, which are presented in the city's former shipyards. Named a European Green Capital in 2013, Nantes is highly regarded for its expansive green spaces and efficient urban sustainability. During the summer, Nantes becomes its own open-air art gallery. A 15-mile-long green line is painted along the pavement with more than 100 art installations, urban playgrounds, and historical monuments. The outskirts of this lovely city are where our story takes place. On Wednesday, April 13th, 2011, neighbors on Boulevard Robert Schumann contacted the local police about a family who seemed to have disappeared. The usual sounds of Mozart, dogs barking, and the family talking had fallen silent in the last few weeks. Mail began to pile up in front of their door, and the windows had been shattered since that last Sunday. The windows being shattered up for so long was of particular concern because every morning neighbors watched the mother of the house open them to let in the morning sun. Even more strange was how the mother's vehicle, a Volkswagen Golf, was parked nearby, and it had never left this entire time. Parishioners at Saint Felix, where the family attended church and the mother taught, grew increasingly worried about her absence. Easter was only a few weeks away, and there was no sign of her. On Friday, April 15th, the Nantes Public Prosecutor's Office opened an official search into the whereabouts of the Dupont de Ligonnès family. A criminal investigation was quickly opened after they unearthed suspicious behavior and alarming purchases that were made by the father, Xavier. Investigators discovered that he had been registered at a shooting range since December 2010. He had inherited a .22 caliber rifle from his late father, who had passed away that January. In March, Xavier had purchased ammunition and a silencer for the weapon. In early April, he stopped at a do-it-yourself store, similar to a Home Depot in the United States, where he made several bizarre purchases. The items included a shovel, a roll of large trash bags, and a box of adhesive plastic paving slabs. The father had also purchased cement, black sacks, a spade, cleaning fluid, and a wheelbarrow. On April 20th, 2011, a welfare check was issued for the entire family. Given the strange exterior appearance and the circumstances surrounding their disappearance, the police forced their way into the residence. There they observed blood on the kitchen floor and on several cleaning items, including a mop, a broom, and a bucket. And there were also 2 tiny blood stains on the lower leg of a chair. However, investigators found no sign of violence or blood at all in the upper bedrooms. There was no obvious crime scene. Investigators left with no real clues as to what had happened to the family. However, they did notice that multiple items of historical and personal value were missing from the home. Various family heirlooms, including photos, were now gone. Then an investigator came across a receipt for quicklime. The investigative team returned to the residence the following day. Based on the receipt for quicklime, they immediately searched the garden area, specifically focusing on the front area of the cellar entrance. Under the balcony terrace, they noticed disturbed earth, and that recent changes appeared to be made to the patio that looked out of place. There, they discovered a horrifying scene. Lying under the terrace, beneath a freshly poured slab of concrete, were bodies, multiple bodies. Each had been wrapped inside burlap sacks and heavily covered with quicklime. 7 bodies in total were unearthed, including an adult female, 4 children, and 2 dogs. The 2 Labrador retrievers, Jules and Leon, were laid in 2 different spots. One of them was buried under the garden terrace, and the smaller dog was buried under the lawn. The victims were identified as Agnes Dupont de Ligonnès, 49, and her 4 children, Arthur, 20, Thomas, 18, Anne, 16, and Benoit, 13. Autopsies were performed the following day. It was determined that the victims had all been drugged and then shot at least twice in the head or the chest while asleep. The youngest son, Benoit, may have suffered prolonged violence. In addition to the 2 bullets found in his head, Benoit also had 3 additional bullets lodged in his chest. This indicated that the drugs did not easily work on him, and the assailant had unloaded 3 bullets to ensure that he was dead. Although an exact date or time of death for the victims could not be determined, it was believed they had all been deceased for over 2 weeks. But the patriarch of the home, the father, Xavier, was nowhere to be found. An international warrant for a witness was now issued to locate him. Security cameras and hotel receipts, paid with his credit card, proved that his first week after leaving Nantes had been across France. On the same day the bodies were discovered, a metallic blue Citroën C5 with registration belonging to Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was identified in the parking area of the Formula One Hotel in Roquebrune-sur-Zone, a city he had once lived in. Surveillance footage in the parking area captured the suspect walking away, leaving his car behind. The man looks directly into the camera, almost acknowledging, aware that this video would be shown to the police not long after. It was April 15th, 2011, when he was last seen. Xavier appeared to have vanished into thin air. The 2 other vehicles registered to the family, a Pontiac and a Renault, were never located. The woods and mountainous terrain left an almost endless landscape of possible locations for the man to retreat to. The areas were widely searched by helicopters, canine units, and hundreds of officers specifically trained for such tasks. Judge Robert Chalion coordinated the extensive search, not just for the suspect, but for 2 years. The police in Nantes would try to locate a woman known as Claudia, a German woman whom Xavier had once seriously been involved with, almost married, in the 1980s, and the 2 had stayed in touch over the years. It was later learned that Xavier had stayed in the town of La Ponte, 200 kilometers away. On the same day, neighbors had first contacted police. A woman had also gone missing on the 14th in the same area. The woman, identified as Colette de Rome, had lived in the village of Lorgues, where the family had lived back in 2003. One of the last known sightings of Xavier was on April 12th. He booked himself a room at Auberge de Cassagnan, a luxury hotel in La Ponte near Avignon. The man identified himself as Xavier Laurent. He stayed in a suite at the 5-star establishment. He had stood out to the hotel staff, who quickly remembered him when the police interviewed them, because he was alone in a place usually occupied by couples. Sylvie Boucher, one of the hotel and restaurant partners, remembered the man vividly. She had been in the garden, walking under the balcony of his suite, when he waved at her. The man, deemed a murder suspect, wasn't at all suspicious or even withdrawn. In fact, she described him as being very friendly and approachable. Later that day, Sylvie accompanied the man to the restaurant, which she often did for guests. There the man dined alone, discussing wine at great length with the sommelier. The man said he was very fond of fine dining, indulging in cordon bleu, stuffed zucchini blossoms, and a bottle of Burgundy. When investigators later interviewed Sylvie Boucher, she was in disbelief, shocked that this nice, relaxed, and very distinguished gentleman was suspected of murdering his entire family, to which she noted that he showed no sign of sadness at all. Other staff members there agreed that the man appeared very happy, content, like a proper marquis, staying a night away from his estate. 2 days later, surveillance footage from an ATM showed the suspect withdrawing 30 euros. By the time the massacre had been revealed and their main suspect known, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès had a large window of escape. He was ahead of the police by 17 days. The violent perpetrator could be anywhere in the world at this point. On April 27th, about 500 people gathered, marching in silence to where their family was killed, at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann. It was recorded how a great many of the crowd were students, children, like the victims had been themselves. White flowers were laid in front of the house. The next day, the family was laid to rest at Saint Felix Church. Archbishop Jean-Paul James stood over the graves of the mother and her 4 kids, saying to the small group of family, "We are in front of an abyss of absurdity and nonsense." The events leading up to the tragic, bizarre incident and afterwards would puzzle homicide detectives, the prosecution, and the entire country of France as they learned the timeline regarding the disturbing and mysterious family murders. So what was known about the suspect and his family? Genuine upper-class surnames are not common in France, where de is still associated with nobility. The roots of the Dupont de Ligonnès lineage go back to before the 1789 revolution, a historical aristocratic line whose forebearer was granted the title of Marquis by King Louis XV. For reference, a Marquis is just below a duke, but above a count or an earl. The Dupont de Ligonnès family, then known as Dupont de Mars de Ligonnès, was given its own coat of arms with a gold helmet and 3 silver stars. This coat of arms was engraved on everything over the generations, from signet rings to the gates lining the entryway of estates. The family was a line of bishops, writers, and philosophers. One member of their line was a 19th century foreign minister named Alphonse de Lamartine. He fought bravely for the abolition of slavery and later became a poet, leaving politics behind. A favorite eulogy of his went, "The more I see of the representatives of the people, the more I admire my dogs." Now that is a line I can certainly support and get behind. Like many aristocratic families did, the Dupont de Ligonnès family lived in Versailles, the city which was the center of the royal power, before relocating to Nantes. Their eldest son, Arthur, wasn't Xavier's biological son. Agnes in her 20s had an affair with a man, which was quite scandalous for her family. Although she was not of aristocratic heritage like Xavier was, Agnes did hail from a very prosperous and respectable family in Versailles. When Xavier met the beautiful, intelligent, single mother, he didn't care that Arthur wasn't his. He married Agnes and adopted the 2-year-old boy as his own. You can see and sense in their photos their centuries-old Gallic breeding. They are all beautiful in a classic, refined European way, all a bit serious-looking, very elegant and civilized, bordering on stuffy and pretentious to some. Neighbors all described the family as being very polite, but they told officers that the mother was authoritarian, very strict, and was considered aloof when compared to her husband, Xavier. She was always nice, they said, but she was distant and not sociable. Local residents the police interviewed all said that they were a quiet and respectable Catholic bourgeois family. Nothing alarming or strange, much less criminal, about them at all. There were no known major family problems, domestic or otherwise, but strange messages the French prosecutor would call delusional and contradictory began to surface. On April 3rd, Xavier and Agnes, along with their 3 younger children, had all gone out to dinner together and then to the cinema. At 10:37 p.m., Xavier called his sister, Christine, and left the following voicemail. "We spent our Sunday evening in the cinema together, then in a restaurant, and we've just got back. I'm just calling to ask if it's too late to speak to you on the phone, and now I see it's gone to voicemail. But I was surprised. You spoke to me about Bertram, who's getting ready for his flight? Huh? But I thought he'd only just arrived, so I was a bit surprised. Anyway, sending you my love. If it's not too late, call me back or send me a text, and I'll call you. Okay, I'm going to put the kids to bed. Say hi to everyone. See you soon. Maybe." This recording was only released in late 2019 and only has added to the mystery of the case. The following day, on April 4th, Anne and Benoit didn't attend classes at their private school, La Perverie Sacré-Cœur. The school claimed they had received a call stating that the kids were ill. Their friends became increasingly more concerned when they couldn't reach them for days by text or online. Then one of them remembered a strange rumor that their father had been offered a job transfer to Australia, but neither Anne nor Benoit had ever mentioned they were leaving. A few nights later, one of the neighbors claimed he heard the dogs howling incessantly throughout the night, and then there was only silence. 2 weeks before the family's bodies were discovered, this same neighbor witnessed Xavier dressed in shorts and wearing boat shoes, walking back and forth from the house to his car. He was carrying large bags from the residence into his Citroën C5, which is a large family car similar to a sedan. The weapon used in the murders was identified as a .22 caliber rifle after his father, Hubert, died on January 20th, 2011. Xavier had cleared out his place. His father's neighbors told investigators that Xavier had attempted to recover a signet ring and inquired if he had left any money. Hubert had died in poverty and left his son nothing. But while clearing out his residence, Xavier discovered a .22 caliber rifle and took it. The investigation revealed that Xavier had obtained his firearms license back in February. He first bought bullets for the rifle on March 12th and went to a nearby shooting range on 4 different occasions between March 26th and April 1st. During this period, Xavier had also been spending time with his sons Thomas and Benoit, teaching them how to shoot. On Friday, April 1st, the oldest son, Arthur, who was attending college, abruptly left and failed to pick up his monthly check at the pizzeria where he worked part-time. According to his boss, that was very unlike Arthur, who collected his wages on the 1st of every month, like clockwork. The next day, Xavier purchased 4 bags of quicklime from different shops in the region. That Sunday, one of their neighbors, Fabrice, who is believed to be the last to see Agnes before she vanished. Investigators, the prosecution, and the coroner believed that the family members were killed between the night of April 3rd and the morning of April 5th. The last day the children had attended school had been the 4th. It was believed that Thomas was killed after the rest of his family, sometime on the night of the 5th into the early morning of the 6th. According to the closest timeline that investigators could come up with, it was suspected that Xavier had lured Thomas away from school and back home. The night before, the father and son had dinner together at a high-end restaurant near his college. The 2 waiters recalled how Thomas wasn't feeling well toward the end of the meal and how the father and son barely spoke a word. Based on testimony provided by Thomas's friends, he said he would be absent from school the next day because his mother had fallen off her bike and was in the hospital. His friends found that odd, since his mother never rode a motorbike. There were also the bizarre calls Agnes's employer received, stating that she was very sick and she had been hospitalized with gastroenteritis. Then her employer received another letter not long afterwards, claiming that Agnes was resigning from her position because her husband had received a once-in-a-lifetime career opportunity, and she and the children were joining him in Australia. The private Catholic school the 2 younger children attended received a similar letter, dated April 6th, indicated that following an urgent job transfer, the whole family was relocating to Australia. There were also intentional actions taken which implied that the family had moved. Everything had been taken care of before Xavier vanished. The lease on the house had been terminated. All financial accounts had been closed. A final payment was sent to the private school. Inside the mailbox of their townhouse rental laid a small card, which read, "Mail to be returned to sender. Thank you." In stark contrast as to what the children's private school and Agnes's employer had been told. The letters to Xavier's family claimed the family had moved to the United States. In these letters, that can be described as outlandish, almost cinematic, that were sent by Xavier to several of his relatives regarding the real reasons behind his family's sudden disappearance. The letters were dated a few days after it was believed the murders occurred. The letter began, and I quote, "Hi everyone, big surprise. We've left urgently for the United States under very unusual circumstances." In the letters, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès claims that he was a secret agent working undercover, working for the United States DEA. His position had become jeopardized, and he and his family were going to be placed in witness protection. Xavier described himself in the letters as a key witness in a future trial involving high-ranking figures in international drug trafficking. The family would be relocated to somewhere warm with good music. They would be provided with new identities, and he would not be able to make further contact with any of the family for several years. However, there was nothing to indicate that Xavier had any international connections or was otherwise in demand by a company, much less that he had a stable career. There was nothing in his known life or history that could warrant such a drastic change. In fact, Xavier had barely been making ends meet. Since 2003, he had worked as the manager and sole employee of Cellref, a company that helped restaurants be listed in online tourist guides. It was revealed that Xavier was the creator behind several different businesses. Cellref in particular appeared ambiguous and likely fraudulent. Cellref had a public commercial website with very minimal information. He was the manager and hired 6 salespeople in 2003, but they were all released of their position not long after. The last time any company data had been filed with the French Register of Commerce was in 2004. The company was based in Pornic, although only about an hour drive or train ride from Nantes. The father opted to work out of town, Monday through Friday. What was even stranger was how small his income was. Xavier claimed to earn around 4,000 euros a year, which would be $4,576 US. However, the family had 4 vehicles, and the rent alone was 1,300 euros a month. Investigators believed that his ad company was a fraud, a phony company he had established to borrow money from banks and individuals alike. Only a few days after the family's bodies were discovered, and a search for Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was launched, a woman came forward claiming to be his mistress. The woman, who referred to herself only as Christine, lived in the Paris area and had been involved with Xavier for several years. According to Christine, she received a very ominous letter from him on the day of or the night after the alleged murders took place. The letter said, "We had some good times together. Now you are going to be acquainted with sorrow." The woman was terrified of what he might do to her when she read that he was the prime suspect in the family's murders. She even moved out of her residence in fear Xavier would show up. Not only had their relationship been sexual, but she had lent him upwards of 50,000 euros. Christine had recently pursued legal action against Xavier in an attempt to get the money back from him. The investigation unearthed the depths of his financial strain. Agnes had used inheritance to pay off 3,000 euros of debt, in addition to around 80,000 euros she had been using from family wills between 2004 and 2006 to support the family. Agnes stated in a letter to a friend of hers in February of that year that her husband had taken all of her money and had even borrowed 50,000 euros from his mistress. She spoke of her marriage having turned rigid and quasi-military, with Xavier not paying attention to her at all anymore. It was also learned how Agnes had written on a forum, a medical forum, about her marital problems, and how Xavier had even said to her that a family suicide as a group wouldn't be that big of a catastrophe. Shortly before Agnes disappeared, she had confided in a nun at Saint Felix Church. The holy woman informed investigators that Agnes had said to her, "Pray for me, I'm going to need it." Agnes was the one who was primarily supporting the family's living costs. She worked at a private high school as a supervisor, and she was involved in the Diocese of Nantes, where she taught catechism. The reason that her prominent role in the church and her deep faith and spirituality is pertinent to the case is that Xavier had been brought up in a fanatical religious environment, whose mother was the leader of what many would coin a cult. Born to Hubert de Ligonnès, an engineer, and Geneviève Therese Matre, Xavier's father left the family sometime when he was a young child. It is believed that these events may have contributed to his shattered, delusional psyche. In 1964, his mother, Geneviève, founded the Church of Philadelphia. The prayer group was set up for influential families in Versailles to come together. His mother's mission was to establish a new world order of believers, purified from the stains of the past. The group didn't appear to be anything sinister or perverse, but it garnered regular attention from the French judicial authorities. In fact, one of the detectives of the homicide investigation learned from Christine that she had become pregnant with Lucifer's baby when she and her siblings were younger. They weren't fazed by Latin masses at 6 a.m. and even monastic retreats they were forced to go on. But as they aged, the practices became more drained and burdensome. Some may even say sinister. The kids were surrounded by an environment heavily laden with beliefs in mysticism and religion-based fear. Their mother's top priority was her cult, and she used the family fortune to finance it. One by one, she sold off the family's properties around France. The French newspaper Le Parisien spoke to one of his childhood friends who believed that Xavier had been overtaken by a mystical delusion. Investigators scoffed at this notion. They pointed instead to the extreme lengths of calculated planning the perpetrator had taken in the month before the murder, and afterwards to conceal a crime as if it had never occurred. Some investigators on the case did theorize that Xavier may have killed his family under a Da Vinci Code-style ritual. In other words, to appease, to sacrifice to some dark force. Officers staked out the now recluse elderly mother Geneviève at her townhouse in Versailles, since there was a theory that Xavier may have still been closely tied to the cult, utterly devoted to his mother's disturbing, extreme teachings. According to phone records, Xavier's last conversation with his mother was on April 4th, the same day he spoke to his sister Christine. Christine stated to the police that she and her mother were in a complete state of incomprehension and that she was feeling extremely tired and unwell. They both refused to believe that Xavier was involved in the killing of his wife and his own children. Extended members of the Dupont de Ligonnès family were ambushed by the police, with one who remained anonymous, complaining to the press about how some 60 officers from a specialist response unit broke down our door at 6 a.m. He described it as a disgraceful overreaction, and how the idea that they were all part of a strange familial cult protecting a family murderer was obscene. The case sat cold for several years, with tips and alleged sightings of the suspect pouring across detectives' desks, but nothing significant ever surfaced. Then, in April 2015, someone walking near the town of Fréjus, near where Xavier was last seen, discovered what appeared to be human remains. Speculation ran wild across the media on whether it was the bones of the long-wanted family killer. DNA results erased any hope that the case was coming to a conclusion when they were proven to belong to someone else. 3 months later, in July, a journalist with AFP received a letter. Inside was a photo of 2 of Xavier's sons, Arthur and Benoit. The letter was signed with Xavier's name and the words, "I am still alive from then until this hour." However, the authenticity of the letter could not be verified. Almost 3 years passed without receiving any solid leads. Everything shifted in the investigation in January of 2018, when the police received a tip from someone claiming to have seen Xavier on the grounds of a monastery. At once, the French police surrounded the property, setting up a large dragnet in the area. A dragnet is also referred to as a raid, a sweep, or a cleanup operation. 20 armed officers stormed the medieval holy building in southern France, but they were met with vows of silence. Les Carmes des Chaux, a strict Catholic order of holy people whose lives are devoted to silence, peace, and prayer, ran the property. The monks and nuns, under their vows, refused to speak to investigators. Surrounded by endless mountains and forests, the centuries-old property was the ideal hiding spot for a fugitive. If Xavier was still there, he was hiding deep in the forests around the monastery, or was being protected from authorities. Then the leads went cold again. In 2019, the police received an anonymous tip about a man flying from Paris into Glasgow, Scotland. He was promptly arrested and taken into custody once he landed at the airport. When a DNA test was performed on the man, the police held their breath. Could they have finally found the person responsible for the family massacre and not? Officers searched the man's house in Ligonnes, a western suburb of Paris, but nothing of significance was discovered. The man, whom neighbors reported to the press, was identified as Guy Joan, a man of Portuguese descent, married to a woman from Scotland. Mario Vieira, a man who had known the suspect for over 40 years, stated that it was impossible that he was the suspect. He could not have been the same man whom he had worked with at Renault Flynn's before he retired 4 years prior. Earlier claims had reported that the fingerprints matched that of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, but it was revealed that the DNA did not. Apparently, the French police had received word from the Scottish police that his fingerprints matched their suspect. This led to a hasty announcement that the fugitive had been captured. Then once the DNA was compared and analyzed, they learned it wasn't a match. And they realized that the fingerprint match made by the Scottish police had been partial, which is inconclusive under French law. The same year, this innocent man was arrested and suspected of multiple murders. A young couple purchased the late family's home. They completely renovated the place, including the exterior, but rarely did a day pass without the new owners being faced with the lingering macabre history of what had happened inside their home. Tourists and locals would stop at the sinister address to take photos of what France had now deemed the House of Horrors or the Nantes massacre. This case became so notorious in France that doing a Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès became its own quip that people used to describe someone who mysteriously vanished into thin air. And yet, this story is still not over. The case is ongoing and still open. Investigators still receive information as to possible sightings and online activity indicating that Xavier is still alive. Xavier held a special place in his heart for country music and Western culture. In the 1990s, he had traveled to the United States with his two best friends, Michel and Emmanuel. While there, they spent some time in the town of Alpine in Brewster County, Texas. This is a very tiny county in western Texas, with only 9,508 people counted at the most recent census in 2024. In 2016, a retired French investigator named Gilles Gallou, who had worked on the case for years, went to Brewster County to have a visit with the sheriff. When he spoke with him about the case and the suspect's possible ties to the area, the sheriff went to Facebook and posted an appeal to the public as to if they had seen or heard anything about Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. One person called the sheriff's department and claimed they had seen someone matching the description of the suspect in 2020. They said the man strongly resembled him. He had a French accent, and he was with a black Labrador. Now, if this had been just another sighting across Europe or another country, then I wouldn't find it so significant. But in such a tiny county where in all likelihood none of the residents were even familiar with this international case, this is a fascinating possibility that Xavier made his way back there. The French investigator Gallou also pointed out the strong possibility that Xavier could have used his experience and skill as a traveling salesperson to go undetected for quite some time. He speculated how Xavier may have rented a motorhome, drove around completely undetected in France for a while, and then escaped from Provence. The main reason to support his theory was found amongst the activity discovered in cybercafes, which Xavier had used in the weeks leading up to the murders. He specifically researched long-term parking in industrial zones, maritime transport, and motorhome hire agencies. This all suggested that Xavier could have lived off-grid for some time before leaving France altogether. All of this evidence the police ignored. On June 2nd, 2025, the French show Appel à témoins, or Call for Witnesses, a show that is very similar to the famous America's Most Wanted, where the primary purpose is to appeal to the public to help solve cold cases. A shocking submission was made around 11 p.m. on the night of the broadcast. A man called, identifying himself as Father Mark. Father Mark, who claimed to be from a monastery in Plavia in the Aude region of France, swore that in 2022 he had heard the murder confession from Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. The host of the show, Julien Courbet, pressed him to clarify the details of what happened. Father Mark described Xavier as a man in tears who stayed at the monastery for 4 days. However, when the Saint-Pierre monastery was contacted by the media outlet, Tribune Chrétien, to inquire further into these claims, an official there stated, "There has never been a Brother Mark here. This is a completely fabricated affair." According to the editor of the show, Stan Vignon, he spoke with the alleged priest almost all night until the man confessed at last to not being a priest at all, but that he had other information to provide. On the surface, this would appear to be yet another false lead, a shocking declaration made by someone who was delusional or simply wanted their 5 minutes of fame. But what if it wasn't? The connection between the Catholic Church and the fugitive couldn't be denied. The monastery has no legal and definitely not a moral obligation to cooperate with authorities or the press to expose anyone staying at their properties. Monasteries are known for being the last resort for fugitives or someone that needs protection, for good reason. New details also emerged in June 2026. There was strongly supported evidence of a digital footprint left by Xavier for several years after the murders occurred. The newspaper West France conducted its own investigation into the suspect's online activities. With the help of experts, they cross-compared and analyzed posts and profiles that were known to have been used by Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. They were on a niche Catholic web forum called site-catholique.com. In the forum, the suspect openly ranted about his loss of faith and triggered many theological discussions. Xavier first posted on the religious forum in March 2009 under the name Xavier and then under Ligo beginning in 2010. The last known message under Ligo was from April 8, 2011, 5 days after the date it was believed that the family had been killed. Then, in this year, a third account was discovered. The messages were analyzed using multiple methods, including OSINT, also known as open source intelligence methods, cross-referencing publicly available information, and the private letters and writings of Xavier within the case file, none of which had been publicly released. They also analyzed 100 randomly selected accounts from the same forum, none of which shared any similarities in writing style and habits that were seen across 3 accounts, including Xavier, Ligo, and the newly discovered one, Epsilon. Some interesting similarities included how on all 3 accounts, the users inserted words in all caps in the middle of their sentences. They did this strictly to emphasize their statement. For example, the user Xavier wrote words like create and beginning. Ligo would use words like deliberately, and Epsilon wrote the phrase, he offers no alternative, and sometimes simply just the word no on its own line. All three also used quotation marks and exclamation points in dramatic, unique ways. They didn't use them to cite a source as someone normally would, but rather to convey irony or to place distance between themselves and the statement. They would stack multiple question marks and exclamation marks together, sometimes 3 or even 4 in a row. This excessive use of the marks in the same way is incredibly similar. They also often ended arguments with QED in all caps and would use the same expression, non-exhaustive list. 7 out of the 8 users that Xavier and Ligonnes regularly interacted with were also interacted by Epsilon, with the assistance of a stylometry expert, who is someone who analyzes the style of a person's writing, specifically their use and frequency of words, in particular connecting words, like of, the, and, in addition to their vocabulary and the utilization of unique words. According to experts, these patterns are extremely difficult to mimic. A second stylometry expert, Claude Allen Roten, analyzed these messages and stated that the markers are consistent, the punctuation, the syntactical habits, the accounts that interact. They're always the same. Roten was a well-known and highly respected Swiss microbiologist and expert in computational stylometry, who gained attention for his contributions in an infamous cold case of a 4-year-old boy, Gregory Villemin, in 1984, which ultimately led to his killer being discovered decades later. Roten believed that the third account, Epsilon, was very significant to this case, although there were many markers and signs of remarkable similarities between the 3 accounts and Xavier's personal writing. For Roten, the most compelling reason of all was the reference to the 3 kings, a bizarre connection between documents collected from the residence of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès during the initial investigation in 2011. A handwritten letter was discovered in which he cited 3 Old Testament figures, Baasha, Joachim, and Isaiah, all kings who are rarely the center of discussion amongst religious people, even very informed Catholics. Xavier discussed them in the letter to illustrate what he perceived to be contradictions in the Bible between February 22nd and 23rd of 2017. The account username Epsilon posted multiple times discussing these contradictions found in the Old Testament, using the same 3 kings as examples. To put this all into perspective, over the 15 years the religious forum had existed, out of more than 6,500 registered users, only 1 had ever mentioned King Baasha, and that user was Epsilon. What was even stranger about this shared post was how in the private letter of Xavier's, dated from 2008, he addresses the contradiction in the king's age, asking whether he was 22 or 42 years old. In a post by Epsilon on February 23, 2017, the user asks, how old was Isaiah when he became king? 22 or 42? The words almost mirror one another completely. These are difficult to blow off as a crazy coincidence. It is also important to note that unlike most of the users on the forum, there were additional details revealed in the account, which also focused on the story of Cain. In the post, Epsilon addresses the question, why does God protect the killer in the biblical narrative? they also defended the notion that forgiveness by God or by the divine can be received unconditionally. In a private letter of Xavier's titled "To My Women," he questions the tale of Cain's wife, asking, after murdering his brother Abel, Cain fled to another land where he found a wife. Where did she come from? As to what reasons the alleged mass family murderer would have taken the risk of communicating online for several years, the newspaper noted how research has shown that long-term fugitives frequently interact in some capacity. They must maintain some kind of social or intellectual life or interactions with the outside world. Total isolation from society is psychologically draining, to say the least. It can wreak havoc on the psyche, and even fugitives just can't help themselves but reach out to others. Of course, all of these clues were strong indicators that Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was still alive, but they weren't proof. There was no irrefutable evidence of that. Now, if this forum had been a mainstream social media platform, the coincidences and striking similarities that were revealed could easily be dismissed. However, this was a relatively small online community of religious followers. There were only a few hundred users who discussed and debated anything and everything, biblical and theological. Xavier had posted messages every week, multiple times a week, often in the evenings, over the 7 years, including the third account presumed to be his. 1,169 messages were posted. On August 15th, 2017, the user Epsilon fell silent and never posted again. Of course, there was always the small possibility of the third account Epsilon being a copycat, but that didn't seem likely, considering how no one outside of the investigators were ever privy to the existence or content of these letters, much less anyone being aware to the fact that both Xavier and Ligo were Xavier's accounts. Being able to establish a connection between the IP addresses that were used and determining the identity behind the username Epsilon is the key to finding the evidence that the third account was in fact Xavier's. The French judicial authorities are currently investigating this lead. This massacre of an entire family is one of the most horrific and deeply disturbing types of homicide that exists. Contrary to what mass media and true crime documentaries, even some podcasters, portray, it is not a 21st century phenomenon. The act of familicide, or the killing of one's own family, has been recorded for several centuries. It is not isolated to the United States. There is no race, ethnicity, culture, or socioeconomic demographic immune to this kind of crime. Forensic psychiatrist Daniel Zaguri, an expert in his field, has analyzed the psyche of the alleged family murderer in his book, Public Enigma No. 1. Zaguri doesn't claim to have the answers as to why Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès committed the most atrocious and horrifying of acts. Rather, he invites the reader to try to identify with the killer, a man who deeply loved his family and murdered them all, which he claims no one can succeed at doing, but that he can because it is his job to understand the mind of such a person. According to Zaguri, the suspect's mental state was one of psychic splitting. That is, Xavier can compartmentalize his psyche and therefore how he portrays himself to the outside world versus his behavior, his actions, and possibly his true emotions are uniquely split. Zaguri believes his psychic splitting manifested when he failed to reconcile both his mother and his father within himself. According to Zaguri, Xavier struggles to combine these two sides of him. His mother was fundamentally religious, devout, extreme, full of fear and paranoia. His father had long been absent in his life, but he was a womanizer, a highly intelligent man who abandoned his family. Unlike his mother, his father reveled in life, soaking up the pleasures of sin. At 35 years old is the age when Xavier lost his faith. What happened in his life to cause this loss, one can only speculate. To Zaguri, though, his loss of faith signaled the loss of his entire world, and with this loss came the ultimate act of sacrifice, an act of devotion to the divine, being the loss of his family. Zaguri believes that for Xavier, the act of suicide, as it is for many religious people, was the ultimate sin, and something he could not bear doing while his family was still alive. Zaguri speaks that over time, Xavier's identity, his self-worth, his purpose in living, all fell apart. He became increasingly more worn down, drained by his failures. His suffering and deep depression became so unbearable to the point where the killing of his family was the only way, the only outlet he had, so he could then end his own life. I completely disagree with his assessment of Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. No, I am not a forensic psychologist, nor an expert of the criminal mind, but his analysis doesn't match up with his behavior before or after the murders, and everything that is known about Xavier indicates that he was too much of a narcissist to take his own life. I also think that Zaguri is placing him through this lens of distorted religious fundamentalism, a broken man, financially and spiritually, who saw death, his family's and his own, as the only way he could be free of these burdens. However, Zaguri fails to address the specific type of crime familicide is, and the distinct motivations behind the different types of offenders. Everything I have ever studied about familicide, specifically those of male family annihilators, doesn't lead me to share his conclusion. For the final paper in my research methods course at university, I chose the topic of familicide. I conducted extensive research of meta-analysis of criminal profiles of such perpetrators over several centuries and across different cultures and countries. The one thing that remained constant, no matter the time or place the incident occurred, is that when a father figure decides he can't go on any longer, whether it's from depression, family problems, economic strain, or a combination of these factors, and kills their family and then takes their own life, they don't leave the house to commit the act. They commit suicide or attempt to do so at the same crime scene. Such an offender, taken over by mental illness, desperation, and an overbearing sense of self-loathing and guilt, doesn't leave packed for a nice vacation, dine and stay at a luxury hotel, and then disappear into the sunset. This kind of family killer doesn't plan out murders a month in advance and carefully concoct, however delusional it may sound to others, a viable explanation as to why he and his family left the country for good. It has been speculated that Xavier walked away from his vehicle and off camera and headed toward the nearby woods. It is visible in the camera that he is carrying the rifle on his shoulder, but there is no evidence of what he did when he walked away. If he had planned on killing himself after brutally murdering his entire family and then going to such great lengths to cover up their deaths, why would he then wander off into the forest and shoot himself? That makes zero sense to me. And if he had planned to commit suicide, why bother with the complicated, difficult, and very messy task of covering each body with quicklime, placing them inside sacks, burying them, and then pouring concrete over them? Again, if he was a man who had decided to end his life but wanted to sacrifice his family to show his devotion, his faith, then why would he find it necessary to make people believe they had all left for a better life, all to wine and dine himself after the massive undertaking was complete? Everything about Xavier's personality and actions doesn't equate to a man who kills himself after he seemingly got away with the perfect crime. There are also indications that maybe he had help leaving the country altogether, especially given that 2 women he was connected to disappeared around the same time. It is not a leap to think that he knew people who may have been able to provide him with fake identity papers. And with his handsome but relatively generic European looks, Xavier could alter his appearance even slightly and blend in anywhere in the world. For these reasons, it is not at all surprising that people all over the world have claimed to have seen him over the last 15 years. If Xavier did remain in France or another part of Europe, I don't think it's illogical to believe he may have joined a monastery. Perhaps his lone adventure and acts of celebration after killing his family was his last joy before taking his own oath of silence. It is important and interesting to note how the modus operandi of the killer doesn't match what is usually found at a crime scene of a family annihilator. Familicide, like most family murders, tends to show elements of a crime of passion. Whether they were premeditated or not, there is frequent evidence of a struggle, defensive wounds on the victims, and signs of what is described as overkill. But at this scene, at the home, there were none of these. The French prosecutor described how all 5 victims were murdered with methodical execution. Each victim had been shot twice in the head at close range with a gun fitted with a silencer. They were then covered with quicklime to speed up the decomposition process, wrapped in sacks, buried under mounds of dirt, and then concealed under concrete, just like the prosecutor described the killings as being a methodical execution. There are many elements of this case that add up to a professional mass murder rather than a delusional narcissist getting rid of his family and then fleeing to the French countryside. Since the murders and his subsequent vanishing in April 2011, investigators have received more than 1,850 tips, with over 900 reported sightings worldwide. Yet not one tip has led to a breakthrough in this case. The investigation and the media have portrayed Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès as a man who had cold-heartedly plotted out the murder of his entire family and who had attempted to make those closest to him believe he was innocent, with mysterious dramatic letters and emails sent to relatives and close friends. a strange, mystical childhood. What led him to kill his family has left the police and the country at a loss for understanding. But sometimes what appears to be the most impossible answer can hold the truth. The more I researched this case, the deeper I dug into the impossible, the more of a reality it all became. It began in April 2011, when relatives were first told of the horrible news that Agnes and all 4 of the children had been killed, and that Xavier was the prime suspect, the only suspect in the multiple murders. They didn't believe that the bodies were those of Agnes and the children, since the medical examiner wouldn't allow them to be seen. The family held a small private funeral for the victims, with the unusual request that no flowers be present. Their bodies were all cremated within a week of discovery, which is highly unusual and should have raised alarms in a homicide investigation. Xavier's sister and husband Bertram were staunch, unwavering supporters of her brothers. They never once believed that Xavier was capable of harming anyone, much less brutally killing his wife and children. And everything in the investigation led her to believe that something else entirely was going on. Christine was adamant that not only were those bodies not her family members, but that most likely they were all alive in another country, very possibly the United States. Throughout the years, Christine stood by as her brother was demonized, villainized in the media and by the police and prosecution. But no matter how much of a monster her brother was portrayed, she always stood by her brother's innocence. In her book published in 2024, Xavier, My Brother, Presumed Innocent, Christine details the many reasons why she believes he is an innocent man. In 2024, her suspicions and beliefs were cemented when the official police case, including never-before-viewed autopsy and exhumation photos, were made accessible to the civil parties. First, there was the timeline of when it was believed the family members were killed, none of which was supported by the evidence. The sequence of events was based on investigators' presumptions. There is not one piece of evidence that proves when the family was killed, much less an exact time or date of death. The documented evidence the police had enclosed in the case, including multiple witness statements and phone records, doesn't match the story the world has been told about Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. What is particularly bizarre about the speculated timeline is how multiple people, as many as 9 different people in the area, claim to have seen Agnes after April 4th, when she and her children were allegedly killed. One neighbor saw her on the 5th around noon outside the family's house. 2 other neighbors saw her close to the property on the afternoon of the 7th. They saw her walk the dogs and watched the 2 youngest children play outside. After the date, they were all supposedly killed. The case file also revealed that based on phone calls, specified dated statements by witnesses, and written documents, Agnes was in Nantes until Friday, April 8th. Her presence after the 4th was further supported by a note she posted on the front door on the 6th of April. There were also phone calls made by her, Thomas, and Anne between the 5th and the 8th. Initially, this was all explained away by implying that it was Xavier who was sending the texts. But his known movements didn't align with the pings of the cell tower to these phones. In addition, several people testified that the texts they received were unmistakably the writing style of Agnes. And yet, according to records, her sleep apnea machine was last used on the night of April 4th, which was used as evidence to presume her approximate time of death. On the night of April 6th, Xavier communicated with a friend and mentioned a permanent change of lifestyle. On the 10th, he left the house keys to his friend Emmanuel and asked him to come to the property quickly. He did, along with another friend, visited the home the next day. They entered the residence and the cellar and later reported to the police that nothing under the terrace had been disturbed. When the police went to the home on the 18th, they observed a mop that was still damp and a bottle of cleaning fluid that was placed on the table. However, these items were not noticed by either of his friends on the 11th or the 2 earlier visits made by investigators on the 13th and the 15th. When the bodies were discovered on the 21st, the quick-setting cement poured over the bodies was not yet dry. This indicated that it had been poured very recently. The tools discovered at the burial site contained no fingerprints or DNA. In fact, they were not the same tools Xavier had ever bought, and those particular tools he purchased have never been found. There were also no fingerprints or DNA located on the bags in which the bodies were placed. It is noted in the case file that some officers didn't believe it was possible that one individual was capable of pulling off this considerable amount of work. When the police interviewed his 2 closest friends, Michel and Emmanuel, they revealed that Xavier had told them in July of 2010 that what ended up folding was likely going to happen. In an email, he described that he and his family would be involved in a dramatic and intentional disappearance. Whether it was a fire, a group suicide, or a car crash, he was going to be implicated in the act. Xavier requested 2 things of them. First, that his friends preserve the emails so their authenticity could be verified. Second, to ensure that his parents, brother, and sisters never believed he is truly guilty of the crime, no matter what the police accuse him of, even if the evidence appears to be conclusive. This is strange, to say the least. Writing these emails 10 months before the incident occurred, and then proactively taking steps to undoubtedly paint himself as the only suspect, leads to very interesting possible conclusions. That Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès purposely and deliberately made himself look like the killer. The overwhelming transparency he presented within his behavior before and after the event was clearly intentional. In the letter sent to his family, Xavier writes, and I quote, "When you read this letter, we will no longer officially exist. Although the police portray him as this calculated, cold-blooded mastermind behind the multiple deaths of his family and subsequent vanishing act, his actions show anything but calculated, yes, but also ridiculously sloppy and transparent when you take a moment and pick it all apart. Xavier left numerous traces, including electronic, written, and financial, all of which directly led the police and the prosecution to him. He even wrote in detail exactly where they could find the bodies underneath the terrace. And yet the crime scene was meticulous. Not a sign of violence anywhere in the house, except for the minimal spots of blood found in the kitchen. There is no evidence that he was involved in the killing or the burial of all the bodies, or what date they even occurred. Xavier left Nantes on the 10th, according to his activity. However, no one, including any of the neighbors, ever saw, heard, or had knowledge of any work being done in the garden. He was witnessed by neighbors multiple times in early April, and never once was he observed wearing dirt-covered clothing or appeared to be exhausted in the least. If Agnes was seen up till the 9th, and according to his phone records and movements, Xavier was traveling between Angers and the Vendée region, emptying out his older son's apartments. The timeline based on testimony and clues also indicated that significant changes at the property were made after April 11th in the area surrounding the cellar door, near where the bodies were buried, and the kitchen floor was mopped shortly before the 18th. There was also the motivation behind the letter. If Xavier had killed his family, what was the point in the letter being sent to his relatives? Stéphane Goldenstein, the lawyer for his mother and sister Christine, doesn't doubt that Xavier wrote it, but it may have been written under duress. I don't think that was the case. Rather, he attempted to make everyone in his circle, and by extension the authorities, believe that he and his family had relocated. What was very telling and interesting about the content of the letter was his complete absence of any emotion toward anything or anyone other than his dogs. He wrote about how, fortunately, someone else took both of the dogs, so they won't be separated. He gave specific details, instructions on how to handle any of his outstanding affairs, such as subscriptions that needed to be canceled. The end of the letter comes off so calloused and arrogant in its attempt to conceal his true nature. It reads, P.S. No need to worry about the porpoise and the dugout canoe. They will remain there, nor the rubble and other junk piled up under the terrace, at the back of the garden, and in the cellar. It was there when we arrived. How ironic that this is the exact spot where his family was all buried. Or was that his intention, to instruct the police all along? There was also the fact that Xavier had documented back and neck problems. It got so bad at times he would have to lie down flat on his back for hours. What was the logic in the theory that one man alone shot 5 people multiple times and then carried them one by one down the stairs, their heads and chests bleeding profusely, mind you, through the kitchen and out to the yard, without 1 ounce of evidence left behind? The sheets which covered the bodies were soaked in blood, but the sacks which they were placed in only protected the upper parts, and yet somehow there was no blood spatter anywhere. No blood on the walls, the trim, the baseboards, the floors, the ceilings, the stair railings, nothing. The time and effort it would take to excavate the ground and bury 5 human bodies and 2 large dogs is tremendous. Given his known timeline, it would be virtually impossible for Xavier to have done this all on his own. However, a professional team could do it within a few hours without causing any disruption or unnecessary attention. And what may be the most alarming of all is the conflicting information found within their autopsies. The measurements, weight, and facial structures, although in the process of decomposition, didn't match the known morphology of the alleged victims. Arthur and Thomas were mixed up in the autopsy reports. The woman whom the coroner claimed was Agnes was significantly heavier than she was known for being. Several of the victims' face appeared to have been purposely deformed, almost smushed in, to be unrecognizable. In May 2024, these photos, along with the police case files, were made available to the family. Not even one of the bodies or the faces were identified as being Agnes or any of the children. Now, according to the exhumation and autopsies, the DNA collected from the 5 bodies matched personal belongings found on each family member. But what does that really mean? Because the lab claims it matches doesn't mean it's indisputable evidence. We, and I mean our society, especially the true crime community, tends to place a great deal of trust and faith in DNA, as recent events involving the despicable forensic scientist Yvonne Missy Woods of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation has revealed. There are individuals and even organizations who will cut corners, manipulate, and even blatantly deceive others by tainting the results. For anyone out there who is not familiar with this person and her crimes, in 2026, she pled guilty to multiple felonies, including perjury and forgery, manipulating DNA data in over 1,045 cases between 2008 and 2023. These crimes included rape, burglary, and homicide. It may sound preposterous, even laughable to many of you, to think that Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès worked as an undercover agent, a spy essentially, for the United States DEA. The idea that his family were under short notice orders by elite collaborating authorities, whisked away on a private jet to the States, with their old identities and lives essentially erased. But history has proven that truth is often much more bizarre than any fiction. I wouldn't discount this story as being a bunch of nonsense, a fabricated tale of international espionage, because the fact is that law enforcement, the military, and the government are perfectly capable of this exact thing. What remains of this case is nothing but puzzling questions, bizarre circumstances, and head-scratching hypothetical scenarios. Although, of course, in reality, it would be wonderful, such a relief, if all the family members were alive. The most perplexing and disturbing theory of all may be that they were never killed. If it was all an elaborate ruse, that Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès had planted the seeds for years, so he was painted as a brutal, merciless family murderer for law enforcement and the media to focus all their resources, all their attention solely on him. Meanwhile, Agnes and the children are safely relocated, and weeks later, the father is reunited with his loving family, perhaps in the same tiny, remote Texas county he fell in love with all those years ago. The most unsettling element of this theory is that if in fact the bodies were not those of the Dupont de Ligonnès family, then whose bodies were found buried in the garden? Thank you so much for listening to the absolutely fascinating case of the Dupont de Ligonnès family of Nantes, France. This is by far the most compelling case to me. I find it just richly compelling, and I would love to hear your thoughts, your theories, anything you would like to share about this case. You can reach me on social media or through my email, as shown in the episode description. If you enjoy the show and would like to support it, please make sure that you are following or subscribed on your listening platform of choice, and leave a review and a rating. Thank you so much. Your support and feedback truly makes a difference. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music Stranger. Composed by Stereocode.